Welcome to In the Demo, a show about the stories that get told about groups, how those stories got made, what we think those stories get wrong, and why it matters. You hosts? Farah Bostic is the founder and head of research and strategy of The Difference Engine, a strategic insights consultancy focused on helping business leaders make decisions. Adam Piano, author and brand consultant and managing director of brand strategy at Arizona State University. You are now in the demo.
I'm Adam Piano, Generation X.
I'm Farah Bostic, and I'm sick of this game.
we did have a conversation about we may not do the nicknames for this new thing that we're trying. This is our first episode of something we're calling Book Club.
Did you want to say that in unison?
We need a stinger or something that comes in. Like maybe we'll hire the Andrews sisters to sing a little song about Book Club.
That would be a neat trick.
I mean, they've only been dead 40 years. I think we can make it.
Say, for our younger listeners, the Andrews sisters are dead.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Farah and I also have another series about the Andrews sisters that we've been working on for 2 years. Low listenership. Not a lot of people tuning in to learn about the Andrews sisters. Anyway, so the reason we are doing a book club is because as we started reading, or as we completed Millennials Rising, we started making a list, a bibliography. Now, as you all recall from our Millennials Rising episode, not an extensive bibliography. Essentially, they cite themselves and some websites. And there were like 5 websites when they wrote that book. Great job, guys. So we have been building this book list over time for the ongoing research that we're doing. We're going to have to read these books. There's about 20 so far. We'll probably end up reading about 35 or 40 by the time we're done. And we thought, we're going to talk about them anyway. Let's record it and share for this wonderful listening and viewing audience.
Yeah. And you know, there's interesting stuff in all of these books, even if we have quibbles with many of them. But it's,
the quibbles are what make it fun.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And they are part of constructing the overall narrative, and I think it's important to understand like how the bricks get laid for these sorts of things.
Yeah, so that part of how each book becomes a brick or builds to the next thing that's stacked on top of it is a really important part of how we're thinking about these, but also talking through the content of the books in their own right as a self-contained piece for its time and place, which becomes part of the greater narrative. So our first book in book club, Cue the Sting, that doesn't exist yet, but let's see what AI music can do, is a book that Farah introduced me to. Farah, you, I think, had already read this book. It is called The Selfie Vote from Kristen Soltis Anderson. I'm looking at my copy here. You discovered this book, and you had read it, I think, before we even started this project together, hadn't you?
No, I was aware of Kristen's work. I'd in fact talked to Kristen once, and then talked to her co-founder a couple of times. But the way that I learned about the book was, I think I was aware that she had written a book. But she was recently on, a couple months ago, an episode of 538 Politics, talking about some dueling pieces in the FT and the New York Times about whether millennials were shifting to the right as they approached middle age or not.
That's right.
And so that book was mentioned, and I thought, well, I should actually finally read this book. So that's how we came across that.
It is a pretty breezy read. So the premise of the book, I will read a synopsis for you, for the listeners. I think this is a book that is worth checking out. There's some stuff we'll talk about that I think makes it a little tricky in the current context. But overall, here's the summary. The GOP's leading millennial pollster offers an eye-opening look at America's shifting demographics and reveals how these changes will affect future elections. The American electorate is undergoing a radical transformation. So true. Cultural factors are reshaping how a new generation of voters considers issues. Demographic shifts are creating an increasingly diverse electorate. And technological advances are opening new avenues for voter contact and persuasion. Kristen Soltis Anderson examines these hot topic trends and how they are influencing the way youth, women, and minorities vote. Blending observations from focus groups, personal stories, and polling results, the Republican pollster offers key insights into the changing nature of American politics. Listening to her on that episode of 538 is my limited exposure. She obviously is a wealth of information. She knows her stuff. I mean, big time. She has the numbers, memorized, committed to memory. She was very nimble in that conversation of being able to bounce around and talk about the shift to conservatism and seemingly being able to pick out flaws in that author's argument about where they were sourcing the data from and the slices that they were showing in those New York Times articles and FT articles. So she's pretty sharp. You did get to speak to her, I know, in the past. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on her as an author and as a pollster?
Yeah, so she is a co-founder of a polling firm called Echelon Insights. They are considered to be a conservative polling firm. Her and Patrick Ruffini founded the company. Part of, she's extremely experienced speaking on things like podcasts for a few reasons. One, she used to co-host her own with Margie O'Mara, who's a Democratic pollster. And then they also, she makes a lot of media appearances. She, used to be a fairly frequent, I think the first time I ever heard of her, she had come on Morning Joe or something, and it happened to be on in my hotel room. And so I was like, oh, she seems smart. I know that when it comes to conservative leaning pollsters, people I know who work on the more liberal side of politics tend to have a lot of respect for Echelon and tend to think that kind of methodologically they're very sound in their practices. They tend to be kind of leaders in methodologies, and that they feel like they get a fair shake. So obviously that will immediately condemn them in the eyes of anybody who's super conservative, because giving the other side a fair shake is not it's not the rules of the game these days. But yeah, we were connected because I think this is probably, I'm trying to remember if it was it had to have been, now that I remember, like, this is how my memory works. I was sitting in a particular location, so I know it was before the Trump election. So it had to have been probably around 2015 when I was originally connected with them. Or maybe, 2015, 2015 it would have had to have been, because I was in a different apartment at the time. So we were connected via a mutual friend, good friend of mine, Bill Butler, who has a data viz and Wikipedia consultancy called the Butler Inc., introduced us. They'd worked together in a previous life. And so she and Patrick very generously got on the phone just to talk to me about what made the way they do what they do different from what I usually do. And I think it's probably came up because I had done a little bit of political work by that point. And usually when it's political work, they really just kind of want a moderator who will do some analysis, but they have a method that they want you to use. And so you don't get to design the discussion guide or the stimulus or anything like that. And it was very different from what I'm used to with traditional, commercial marketers as opposed to political marketers. And so I wanted to be able to have a non-confrontational conversation with somebody and say, like, what the heck is this going? Why
before there was an issue being discussed, it's more just like about the method.
Exactly. Yeah. And it was I think they were also curious about how market researchers for brands and commercial enterprises approach things differently from how they do things. The biggest thing that kind of emerged out of that conversation with them, for me at least, was the realization that we're kind of, the stakes are different, and obviously the stakes are different. But the kind of clearest articulation of that I came to was, no brand I work with has one day every 2 to 4 years where all available consumers will make a decision about whether it's going to be brand A or brand B, and they're only going to make one purchase, and then they're not going to buy again for 2 to 4 years. Like, there are definitely product life cycles that are that long, but consumer life cycles around products that are that long, but it's not the same. It's not like it's down to 2 choices and you have to pick one, and all of that. So they have to, their incentives as researchers are different from my incentives as a researcher. I don't have to
And their pressures.
Yes, and I don't have to predict an outcome. I don't have to be right about how the consumers are going to go. I have to provide a direction, and then we go in that direction and see how we do as we go along. And there's a lot more opportunity for iteration. Even though I know people in the branding world don't feel like iteration happens nearly enough, but like there is, you refresh campaigns from time to time. You do a different campaign every quarter or so. Like, the brand positioning may not change frequently, but you've got a lot of time and market to learn, and that is not the case for political campaigns. So the emphasis is less on learning and more on predicting. And so a lot of how these firms kind of live or die is on how good they are at predicting the outcomes of elections. How are voters going to vote? Not why did voters vote the way they did vote? And what I think, though, is interesting about how Echelon approaches it is I think they look forward and they look back. They try to take more of a historical view as opposed to just like, they all do, right? They're all kind of using their own definitions of what's a likely voter, who's really an independent voter versus not an independent voter, coming up with their own kind of models of how people are likely to respond to things. And I just found them to be really thoughtful about it and really generous with their time in discussing it with me. And then I did later spend a little time in person with Patrick at Personal Democracy Forum in New York. A friend of mine was helping to organize that event, and so he more or less snuck me in. And so I got to kind of just observe how those people were talking about things, and I think it was interesting for Patrick coming from a more conservative point of view. PDF is not really an event designed for conservatives, if we're all being very honest.
Yeah. I was thinking, did he sneak you in or did you sneak him in? Yeah, exactly.
Oh, well, Patrick wasn't the one who snuck me in. That was another friend of mine. But anyway, so so that's how I know of them and had some limited interactions with them. I haven't spoken to them in several years now, but I generally think that they're just thoughtful people about it and are not closely aligned with any given campaign, and so they're not closely aligned with any particular agenda apart from understanding the electorate. And obviously they are conservative, and so they have an interest in figuring out what it will take for conservative candidates to win. But I think they're not MAGA conservatives as a general matter.
And that thoughtfulness definitely comes through in the book.
Yep.
So the full title of the book, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but the title, the bold big words are The Selfie Vote. But then no books can be rewritten now without a semicolon subtitle. But The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America, parentheses, and How Republicans Can Keep Up. It's like, here's the big headline that, Vox can write about. And then we got millennials in there for SEO. And then Republicans, if you're conservative, this book is for you. But that's not her fault. I have a feeling that happens with the publisher.
Probably, yeah.
So knowing that is really informative to about, as you open page one, what you're about to get into. I think there's one big challenge with the book, which is it was written before President Trump. It was written before the 2016 election is final. Yes. That's not the fault of the author, but reading it now is a little bit like a time capsule. So she is making those predictions you just referenced. And it's not that I read it and say like, oh, she doesn't know what she's doing. It's like nobody could have predicted that weird left turn that the world took when the simulation glitched into where we are now. But sometimes I'm reading it and I'm like, well, I don't think this thing about Obama really holds. Like, so now what do I do with this chapter? What do I do? Now that, like I said, that's not the author's fault that things went cattywampus, but as I was reading it, I had to keep on flagging myself like, okay, but what can I learn about millennials at this time? What did we think was happening?
Yeah. And I think that, so specifically, I think the book comes out in 2015. So she's probably writing it like after the 2012 election. and then after the 2014 midterms, like that's when she's working on this book, most likely. I don't know that firsthand, but I'm going to assume. And I think the interesting thing there is, I mean, literally he had not come down the escalator yet before this book comes out. I think we'll talk about kind of broader things happening around this period and around this conversation. But I think the other thing that's interesting, just to drop in here, is that after the 2012 presidential election, in which Mitt Romney lost to Obama, there was a report that was kind of commonly referred to as the GOP autopsy. And it was led by people in the GOP and the party itself to try to figure out why Republicans were losing these younger constituents, more diverse constituents, why they were losing these elections. I think they really thought going into 2012 that like Obama looked kind of weak. The first half of the campaign, he seemed to be annoyed he had to campaign. He was not his best candidate self. And Mitt Romney.
No, there was that one weird debate where he was like drowsy.
Yeah. He just seemed like, why do I have to deal with this? Joe Biden came out swinging, and everyone was like, "Can we get some of that juice? Put it back into Obama."
Right. Put it on this guy.
And so and also I think there was a sense in the kind of in the ranks of the party operatives of the GOP that like Mitt Romney was a nice and honorable man who was a perfectly reasonable candidate who should have done better than he did. Right. And, and obviously there's a whole kind of undercurrent of the Tea Party and other stuff that started right after Obama's initial election and after the financial crisis, yada, yada. But like, this is part of that dialogue. I would place the selfie vote as part of that post-2012 examination of well-intentioned conservatives trying to figure out how they were going to adapt to a changing electorate. The GOP autopsy really emphasized things like immigration policy, LGBTQ policies, and generally being more moderate on a variety of things in order to attract younger voters. They were particularly concerned about millennials starting out so much more to the left than previous generations had. And that they did not do particularly well among millennials with the Romney campaign. So there was a real look at that. And of course, then Trump comes down the escalator and throws a bomb in that pond and just goes, "You don't have to be moderate on immigration. You don't have to be moderate about anything. You don't have to have a consistent set of views at all." And so, like, ideology, what's that? We'll just do personality, and for varying definitions of something working, that worked. So I think we keep that in our minds when we're thinking about that. Just to go back, we were talking before we started recording about my how ringer-pilled I am in my podcast consumption.
I am too.
The other night I was listening to 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, and they were talking about doll parts, I think, from Cole's album Live Through This, which came out 2 days after Kurt Cobain died. And so if you didn't really know much about Hole, you didn't know much about Courtney Love before that album came out, which you might not have, it was very easy to look at that album and think that it was about Kurt dying, when obviously it could not be about Kurt dying. It had been written long before that and just happened to drop 2 days later. And this feels kind of like that phenomenon of like, we're reading it now, knowing what we know happened after this.
And I don't think we'll need, for each book, I don't know that we'll need this much context, but for this book, if people pick it up, I think it's important to know that it is self-contained in this kind of in-between time.
Exactly. But I think this continues to be a conversation on the right, which is, I think I expressed it to you at some point when we started reading this book of like, it's the there's got to be a pony in here somewhere kind of approach of as I was reading the
Yeah,
book, it seemed like, she wasn't trying to make anything up, but she was looking for signal in the noise that there was some way for conservative politicians and conservative campaigns to connect with younger voters. And so
totally.
there's a lot of hopefulness in here that may feel a little misguided to those of us who don't share those politics, and also knowing what happened next. But I think, and knowing where the party appears to be today, the GOP appears to be today, it feels a little naive. But I don't think, given that where it was in time, I don't actually think it was all that naive, but it still was looking for a pony in a pile of crap.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's challenging with hindsight to read it and be like, well, that didn't pan out. I think if I have a question about the book, I got about a third of the way through the book when I messaged you and said, are we sure this is about millennials? Uh-huh. So I think a question that I raise about the just focused on the text itself, she does use the words millennials as in the title 2 of 3. But early on in the book, she sort of says she refers to them as for those eager to dismiss millennials, those born in the 1980s and 1990s. She doesn't get to a hard date and never really defines it, which is something I think you and I are focused on as we read each of these books. And I think we'll create a kind of a visual timeline of how each group categorizes it because it's this shifting time. But the rest of the book, she swings back and forth between saying millennials, young people, the youth, young voters, and that is important. That distinction of, are we talking about millennials, which to you and I is a window, but as we just talked about with Kim Parker from Pew, is not a recognized, by them at least, by the census at least, is not really a recognized firm date. So that swing is important to me because if you're going to put millennials in the title, then let's agree on let's put the ropes around the ring of what we're talking about. Where are we going to have this battle about what millennials think? Hard to pin that down if I don't even know who's in and who's out of that conversation.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge for pollsters because they are. Particularly thinking about internal polling for a campaign, where what they're trying to do is understand who's in their coalition and what is that what do the different constituencies of that coalition need to hear in order to be activated to volunteer, donate, and vote. Those are like the 3 KPIs for a campaign. And so the reason that I think they maybe tend not to actually deal with like generational cohorts and instead deal with these kind of age bands is that I think they have a sense that, like, traditionally at least, the issue profiles of voters shift as we age. And so it's better to talk about young voters most of the time than it is to talk about millennial voters, because I think the expectation was millennial voters would look like every other voting cohort, and as they got older would shift a little towards independence or towards the right.
Right.
And so I think, like, in to go back to your kind of introduction of the thing, putting the name millennial in the subtitle is partly there to market the book. Like, we're all trying to figure out millennials at this, even at that late date, still trying to figure out the millennials in 2015, still trying to figure them out in 2023. That was there to sell the book, because you're right. Once you start getting into the book, you see two things. One is that the selfie thing is kind of a hook every once in a while in the book. Although hilariously, all of the examples of selfies in a political context that are in the introduction, bless her, none of the people taking selfies in her examples are themselves millennials. So even if it's a millennial behavior, the people doing it are boomers. Almost all of them are boomers.
She gives 3 or 4 examples of famous selfies, and they are all boomers, or maybe, I don't know if Ellen DeGeneres might technically be Gen X, but
she's a boomer.
There are no millennials. Oh, you did?
She's a young boomer. She's born like 63 or
Okay.
something. But
Oh,
yeah,
that's so good.
yeah, you've got like not a one. Ellen at
Yeah.
the Oscars, even some of the people that she talked about who were like Nick Gillespie or whatever, like kind of movement conservative journalist types, like they themselves are either old Gen Xers or young boomers. There's
Right.
not a lot of not a lot of and the Pope certainly not a millennial. So that
And
is
can we, in here though, in his heart he is, can we talk a little bit about the selfie as voting metaphor, like the self-expression of the selfie and what she's like? I don't know that I feel like the loop really gets closed on that part of it as well. That, okay, the book is called The Selfie Vote. So then when I started reading it, I thought she was going to say, okay, these are the behaviors of millennials. One of them is that they take selfies, and this is how they express themselves when they vote. But it's kind of like there's a thing called a selfie. Here are examples of people taking them. As you pointed out, they're not millennials. And then there's not like, there is a section on Uber, which again, this is not her fault that Uber is at that point was somewhat novel.
yeah.
But now is kind of a fact of life. It's part of the fabric of everybody's phone.
Right.
But those pieces of content about digital mobile behaviors, I feel like I'm like, yeah, but therefore I'm waiting for that loop to close.
Yeah. So I think one of the things she's trying to connect the dots on, and I think she says this fairly early in the book, is that your political attitudes come from someplace, that your political preferences don't just sort of emerge the day you register to vote.
Right.
And so, and the way you encounter political ideas, political candidates, and campaigns is through a filter of the rest of your life, all your other preferences. And so I think what she's also responding to is the rise of analytics in campaign strategy and the buying of large data sets in order to combine the voter file with people's consumer behavior. So that I think she has an example somewhere in the book about like dog lovers tending to be Democrats or something like that. And so
Right.
you're seeing more ads for Obama because you happen to have, you have a, a customer loyalty card at Petco or, whatever
Right.
it is. And so that was definitely a rising trend at that point. It's not new. And I think the other thing that's going on, just as another kind of little backdrop here, is Republicans actually have been the pioneers of the use of direct marketing and consumer data as a way of segmenting, targeting, and messaging to their
Yeah.
potential constituents, both in terms of trying to recruit voters and also in the sense of trying to deter voters. So they use it both positively and negatively. And the angst that sometimes I think appears on the right is they don't get a lot of credit for having been extremely innovative in this way, right? Like the Obama campaign gets a lot of credit for being like
Right. For
first
using social media.
online
Yeah.
campaign,
So sexy.
which is also kind of like, well, I mean, Howard Dean kind of pioneered that too. Like, not the first out of the gate, but sure, give them their flowers. But no one's giving flowers to Karl Rove for having been really good at direct mail.
Right.
And so now you've got, particularly I think coming out of the 2012 campaign where Romney's campaign was like data heavy. They had, what was it called? Like Project Orca or something like that. That was intended to be pulling together all of these data sets and creating an incredibly sophisticated messaging, targeting, turnout, strategy. And so I think some of the reason she's talking about these behaviors and these devices is that we're trying to connect people's kind of consumer behavior and other online social behaviors to their political behaviors. I don't think, I'm not sure she's totally successful in connecting all of those dots or being explicit enough about why that's. I I'm gonna stop myself there. I think the chapters are laid out trying to draw those connections, trying to say like, this is how they're behaving in this sector and this sector and this sector. And so that might explain why they have the preferences politically that they have, because they're growing up in a culture that looks like this and they're faced with
Yeah.
these consumer options and so on. I think my problem with the selfie metaphor, I guess, is that it's a recycling of something that had been said about the boomers in the 80s, which is they were the me generation,
New
right?
generation.
And I
Yeah.
think there's this symbol, I think she talks about it as the ultimate symbol of an it's all about me younger generation that cares primarily about documenting and broadcasting its own greatness.
Right.
And so she's coming in after the turn, right? The heel turn of the millennial myth has happened. And so now we're feeling in a derogatory mood about these types of behaviors. But I think she's also a millennial herself and doesn't want to participate wholly in that project. So
Yeah. Well,
I think there's
she's also trying to remain optimistic about. She's recognizing that they have turned, or that the story has turned. But I think the book is about how can we win them back? Like, what's the path forward
right
for Republicans to earn their share of these votes? We're not going to get them all, but yeah, I if you put selfie in the title, I'm going to pay attention to the use of that word in the book.
yeah
And I think you're right. Like, the chapters are pretty orderly. That she's making a case. She's stacking the components of essentially like a, what is this, 240-page persona. You know, this is how they do this. This is what they prefer here. Can we talk about rural America and urban areas? There's some content there. I don't know. I don't have the chapter listed here. It's page 92, so I can figure that out quickly that I'm thinking about. There's a conclusion made. I don't disagree with what she says, which is essentially that where people live in more denser areas, they have different concerns. She says, greater density often leads to more democratic leaning politics. I agree that people who live in cities have different needs, different concerns than people who live in rural parts of the country. I think that makes sense. I'm not convinced that means millennials. Although I know if you do like a demographic heat map, young people tend to move and stay in cities, and older people tend to live in rural America. But that's not, is it because they're millennial and they live in cities, or is it because they live in cities in urban areas?
right
You know what I mean? Like, what if we what if we extract the word millennial from all these sentences, and now we just look at the geography of it and the lifestyle of someone who lives in a city, and like a really dense East Coast city? I don't think that's because you're 30 years old. I think that is because you have those same concerns. You're elbow to elbow with people. You are dealing with the structure of that city and transit and taxes and all the things that impact people in a city differently.
Yeah, I mean, that section I also had some some notes on there of like, again, we talk about this a lot. What's cause and what's effect? And so there was something in there about 2/3 of young adults think you can be a renter and still achieve the American dream. And obviously, sort of traditionally, our understanding of what the American dream is homeownership. Right. It's the detached house with the car in the driveway, the picket fence, the 2.3 kids, whatever it is. And that's like, so sure, young adults are changing the definition of the American dream, but the American dream has changed a lot over many decades. And it changes in large part based on kind of what's on offer. Once you've done westward expansion and the great migration west, and everybody's sticking their stake in the ground and then fighting over who actually owns that acre, like, that changes what the American dream is. Factories and cities changes what the American dream is. All of these things sort of change what the American dream is. So that's just like a changing definition of the American dream that is in large part probably driven by two things. One is young people, particularly college educated young people's attraction to cities where high paying jobs are, and the lack of available or the lack of affordable purchase price housing. Like
Yeah,
you
in
can figure
city,
out how
in
to scrape
urban
together the
centers.
rent, but
Yeah,
you can't buy a $3 million apartment.
right.
So that to me is like, is that because they're young? Is that because of property prices? And you know, and what are all the factors that go into play there?
And all that entails. Yeah,
Exactly.
right. Because then that's where the conservatism conversation starts. Is like once there is home ownership, that's where you
Absolutely.
usually see that tilt. It's like all of a sudden
Yeah.
I care about my school taxes and all these things that
Yes.
are related to my mortgage.
Yes. And you also have, she talks about the walk score that people who are buying a home might have of like, how far is it to get to things I need? Do I have to get in the car every time I want a gallon of milk is sort of the example she
Hmm.
gives there. And, again, I think there's a certain amount of like convenience, the price of gas, just the hassle of having, like, I feel that where I live now is like anything I want, I got to get in the car and drive on 2-lane roads in order to
Same
get
here.
to it. And there might or might not be parking at the grocery store because it's a little town and there's not a big parking lot. And, everything's a hassle. So it's not like when I lived in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn and I could just walk out my front door, walk to the end of the block, buy some milk and come back. Like that was, oh my God. I am so
Mess it, yeah.
nostalgic for that. It makes me so badly. My life was so simple then,
I
but it
know.
was also expensive. I mean, like, but there, expense shows up in different ways. I think there's a lot there that also has nothing to do with age group. I was listening to the new PJ Vote podcast that you had referenced recently, and they were talking about why is it so hard to
Searching.
turn commercial space into residential space, and
Hmm.
part of the answer is building codes. But where do those building codes come from? They come from basically like 100 years ago. Somebody decided that this was the ideal life, and
I
that
was surprised how interesting that was. I was like, I don't
yes,
even know if I want to listen to this. I was like,
yes, I was listening to
oh,
it. I was listening to it while bringing my bathroom up to code. That's that's what
yeah.
I
Oh,
was.
so it was like hitting a spot
It
with
was
you,
hitting a
right?
nerve.
Yeah.
And like, but the idea that like, we have to have light and we have to have windows and we have to have, we can't have, the off gassing from a restaurant going into someone's apartment
Yeah.
and like, all of these things. And so like, again, the
And
millennials didn't make this up.
laundry facilities. Yeah.
Yes. Millennials didn't make this up. Like they were not alive at the time. You cannot blame this on them. You can't even blame it on boomers. It was before them. So these are
No.
not rules that are coming up because we're all on our phones all the time. These are rules that predate us and they dictate how we live. And I think this is, dead horse being beaten once again. My feeling about the millennial myth and all generational analysis is it just completely obliterates systems. It completely obliterates the idea that one of the reasons why you have more multiracial millennials than you have in previous generations is Loving versus Virginia, the legalization of miscegenation. Like once
Hmm.
you say it is okay for white people to marry non-white people, then you can start having multiracial children.
Right.
Like it's not wokeness. It's the government getting out of people's way and letting them marry who
But
they love, right?
and a generation before, it's
Yeah.
not like
Oh, yeah.
they didn't go to the polls to vote for this, and then all of a sudden, all millennial couples are interracial. That's
No.
not. I mean, that's the narrative, but that's not what their facts
No.
are.
I mean, I think
And
I shared with you. We'll put it somewhere. I'm sure. Maybe I'll put it in the show's Instagram or something. I asked Midjourney to generate images of a stereotypical millennial couple listening to a podcast,
I know,
and the stereotypical millennial couple is a mixed race couple.
and it drives me nuts. I watch sometimes. I still watch linear television, believe it or not, and I see advertising, and there's never a single race couple in an ad ever. It doesn't. Nope. All couples in commercials must be interracial. It's a law, or same sex. Like
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure this jives. Like we should do an analysis of the overlay of TV commercials in a primetime hour versus
Yeah.
U.S. Census and just see what the what the match is, because
What's actually going on?
I don't think it lines up. It's nice to see
Aspirational. It's
representation.
aspirational.
Yeah, it's nice to see representation, but it's a little over-indexed.
Yeah.
I don't think she is. I don't think she's bad faith in this book. Like
No.
there's a reading of this book where you could take the hairy eyeball to it and say like, oh, she's trying to make a case, and I don't think she's doing that. I don't think she's pulling any of those dirty tricks on trying to make millennials the villain of the story.
Yeah.
But you can see the seeds, like you use the word heel turn, which is one of my favorites, where she's leaving out kind of convenient common sense answers. Like there's a section later in the book where she's talking about millennials, or she says young people in America aren't terribly worried about the fact that the proportion of the population that is in retirement is about to expand significantly. So of course it's like millennials aren't worried enough about boomers, not their problem or fault. And thinking about what I'm sure she would call entitlements or Social Security or retirement. And it's like, well, she says Pew found that only 18% of young Americans think they are aging, that aging America is a major problem, while those aged 50 or older are nearly twice as likely to say the same. And it's like, well, that's kind of convenient for you to forget that. Why would a person who's at this point 25 years old, of course they're going to be less likely than someone who's 15 years away from retirement to be thinking about retirement or thinking it's a problem. Like when I was 25, man, I was just happy to pay my rent, you know. So it's not quite bad faith, but it does that thing where it's like they're not thinking about the future. You know, they don't get it. It's like, well, yeah, that is human nature.
Yes. I mean, yes, this is where we go back to the, period, cohort, and life stage approach that Kim Parker was talking about is, yeah, in your 20s, you're not thinking about retirement as much as if you're nearing retirement. My mother in her retirement talks way more about what's in her retirement savings than she ever did when she and my dad were working.
I think this is human nature.
Yeah, because that's what you're living on, and you're about to start living on that. And the closer you get in time to something, the more present it is in all of your thinking and then also in all of your behavior. So
it's the same way people don't floss until they get a reminder that they have a dentist appointment coming. It's like, exactly. So is that millennials?
I feel
no, that's human nature. You're not bad, everybody. If you're listening and you do that, I still love you.
It's okay.
Less, but I still do have love for you. Yeah.
No,
I'm just kidding.
I mean, one of the things I found myself thinking about in these conversations about retirement and urban versus rural and some of these trends of what young people do versus what older people do is also kind of and it led me to buy a book over there. That's, I think, is the title of the book is, I believe, Deaths of Despair. Because we have this whole kind of trend of talking about social isolation, and obviously it became an ever more important topic in the wake of the pandemic. But one of the things I wondered about was, she was discussing in that chapter about urban versus rural was, she talked about, in response to Pew's question about whether they'd rather live somewhere more widely spaced and with bigger houses or somewhere with smaller houses and more walkable communities, a majority of young people say they'd prefer to live where people are closer together. Which made me wonder, like, is there kind of a general sort of slide towards the GOP being the party of social isolation, the people who live further apart, whose children have moved away, who have to get in the car to go get anything that they need, who don't live very close to a good hospital or their physician or a community center or anything else.
Oh, that's interesting.
Who don't have any of those kind of communal public amenities. I saw a headline, I haven't read the piece, the other day about some Republican politician complaining that younger voters and people in cities and Democrats in general were demanding public amenities like public swimming pools. And now part of the reason they're demanding that is it's getting hotter, guys. Like, people need a place to go where they can cool off, and public
Yeah.
pools are a place like that.
And by the way, that was
And
part of civic life in most small American towns for
exactly.
70 years.
Well, yes and no. I mean, if you read Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, you have plenty of places where they just like filled that thing with cement because they didn't want black people to use the public pools.
True.
But yeah, so like, but it's seen as like, oh, you snowflakes wanting us to provide everything for you. And it's like, well, if I live in a house in a region that didn't used to have air conditioning, like a lot of houses in the Northwest don't have air conditioning because it never got that hot. And now it's
Right.
consistently 100 degrees in the summertime. You have to have air conditioning, or you have to have something to cool you
Totally.
off. So like, they're kind of mixing these things up because the story about liberal snowflake millennials is so endemic that they can't look at like, it's too hot. Like, it's just too damn hot. And now, of course, you have some headlines that I saw yesterday about, the GOP has decided that their position on the environment is screw it, burn it all down, because that they can connect sustainability initiatives to wokeness, and that can be a pejorative. And so they can use that to drive a wedge. We're going to use the environment as a wedge issue now, which it always, it has been kind of since the beginning. But nevertheless, these things are, I go back to the horse I flog, which is like, there is a system happening, and there are bigger factors going on that are driving these preferences and behaviors. And, a more walkable community is one where you feel less isolated. A more walkable community means you're spending less at the pump because you don't have to fill your gas tank as often. Even if you're not environmentally minded, $4, $5, $6 a gallon, depending on where you live, is insane for some people. Like, that is way too much money to be spending for little errands here and there.
You know what? And you make a great point. Like, again, this comes down to this being in a time before the media switch that we're in now, like where down is up and up is down. But early in the book, I think it's chapter 1, or maybe the introduction is page 12. She says, she's talking about how much you can know through data about a voter. And she says, they can know if you like technology, they can know if you have a gun, they can know if you like to knit. And as a result, they can make a very, very good educated guess about if and how you'll vote. And in this book at this time in 2015, it's like, oh yeah, okay. Had I read it then, I would have been like, oh, that's brilliant. Reading it now, I'm like, my question is actually based on the systems point you just made, is actually like, or does the way I vote drive whether I go buy a gun? Like, does the way I vote drive the habits that I have? Like, I don't drink Bud Light because, right? 2 years ago, you would have said like, oh, a Bud Light voter, that person's going to definitely vote for a red, whoever the red candidate is. Now, coming into 2024 elections, you're going to say, oh, you're still drinking Bud Light. Okay, we're going to put you in the blue column. Like,
yeah.
But it's so everything is turned in the system.
Yes. There was another moment where, going back to your reference to Uber, where she was talking about, young people really liking Uber, and some of this being about, they don't have a car. They are living in cities. They've got these mobile
devices. Driving, yeah.
Pick me up,
Yeah.
And there were, people signing Stand with Uber petitions to have Uber in their cities where cities tried to stop Uber from entering them. And the interesting thing is, her frame of that is, we're standing with Uber as against unions and regulation, and that Republicans could say to young urban voters, look who's trying to stop you from being able to take an Uber. We're going to protect your right to take an Uber. Now, of course, several years later, that hasn't aged particularly well, because Uber as a brand is now associated with psychopath startup founders and wage theft and tax evasion.
Yeah. I mean, they've been just this week, they've been on a cycle of really trying to cleanse that reputation again. They do this every half year now.
Yeah, exactly. Every 6 months, let's refresh our image.
Yeah.
But the thing that's funny about that, right, is again, this is an example of her looking for hope in the mess and saying, like, this might be a way to connect with them on this particular dimension. But it ignores some other things, that young people also, it turns out, aren't huge fans of wage theft, aren't huge fans of tax evasion, and that we're now living 7 years later, 8 years later, in a period where Amazon employees and Starbucks employees are unionizing.
Well, it's funny. I read this and my note, because that Uber chapter is just before the chapter on employment trends and millennials in the workplace, which you and I love to talk about. It never gets old. So I did a little bit of research connecting the same dots you're referring to. I'm so excited. I just shared in the chat with you a chart from Bureau of Labor Statistics that shows union rate membership over time. Now, this chart happens to break it out by gender. But I was looking at overall, because theoretically in 2014, 2016, we should see a spike if millennials are more interested in that. And even I was thinking about all the stories I've seen about unionization at Amazon with Apple, technology companies. You do see a little bump in 2020, but not significant. Now, this only goes to 2022. It'll be interesting to look at this. And then what I'm doing now is researching to see if I can get a generational break of it and see, or by age cohort, to see if there is a spike in it. But overall, you could just see the trend, 20% union participation in 1983 overall for Americans, and now down to 10% in 2022 on a pretty much a steady decline. I was expecting, when I started this research, based on what she says, and based on the headlines I read, that it would be ticking back up. I didn't think it'd be back at 20 or even half. But
so I don't know. I have been a union member because I taught at Parsons, and so you're in a teachers union essentially in New York. It's not an option. Like, you don't actually maybe now after some of the Supreme Court decisions, you get to at least not pay dues. But the job comes with being a union member.
Of course.
I had worked briefly as a checker in a grocery store that was in the middle of being unionized. And the union organizer was constantly in the break room trying to get people to sign their union cards. And I was just like, I'm going back to college in a month. I'm not going to still be working here. You don't need me to sign this thing. And
right, my signature is not going to help you. Yeah,
my signature is not going to help you. And I got fired anyway for talking to the guy. And so, which was pretty impressive. They said I'm going to go ahead and say it. The grocery store was known as Hagen's. It's a Northwest chain, I think. And I was told that I was not Hagen material. And I actually laughed because I was like,
Farah, we've all been talking, and we all agree you are not Hagen material. We've been talking about this for some time. I'm sorry this had to come out during this conversation. It was eventually going to be. It was
eventually going to happen, yes. But like the decline in union membership has to do with how many union shops there are and how many union kinds of jobs there are. So there's 100%. That. But this data set is actually really interesting to look at because the decline for women is not much. Like it goes from a little less than 15% union membership in 1983 to where are we now? Sort of 9.6%. So, it's not a non-decline, but it's a much flatter line than it is for men who are going from nearly 25%, 24.7% in 83 to 10.5% in 2022.
Yeah. And intuitively, that's because the change of trades and trade organizations being part of unions. But exactly. I think even though you don't get to just decide you're in a union, if it's like in anything, if I'm really interested in it, if I'm really committed to it, if I really believe in it, I'm pushing for it. It would at least be flat. I mean, the curve does soften, but I don't think I'm not seeing any uptick that makes me feel like, oh yeah, I'm seeing a reflection of that in their policy, in their voting, in anything they're doing here.
I mean, yeah, I think that one's a really tough one to look at the actual unionization rate and say that that's a reflection of people's intentions, because there are a whole lot of jobs that just under the National Labor Relations Act don't qualify as jobs that can be unionized. You also have gig work, which kind of by definition isn't going to be a union job.
Right.
because you
Or a
don't have
job.
an employer. I mean, this is part of why these companies resist having employees per se. They have ICs because then they can't unionize.
Right.
And so, there's a lot going on here, and this decline, it would be interesting to see the numbers pre-1983, because I bet it's an even steeper decline prior to 1983. Because, you also have like manufacturing left the United States, and those jobs were heavily unionized. So why are the women more likely to be, sort of flat on their union membership? Well, because women are still nurses and teachers and in those jobs that often have some kind of union. And it's men's jobs that are less likely to be unionized now. And now I think the other sort of struggle that you have is it's not like all Starbucks employees unionize at once. It's like
Right.
store by store unionization.
Yeah, hand-to-hand
Same thing with Amazon. And so you're talking about 20 total employees in a Starbucks shop. So I would expect these numbers to not be terribly impressive under the circumstances of the way we hire people now and the size of these shops. And also, it's interesting which sectors are trying to reunionize. And then the other thing I would add to that is a lot of these folks who are unionizing are not necessarily unionizing with the traditional big established unions. They are forming new unions. And I think that's a whole other, we could do a whole podcast about labor relations.
But that would be an interesting examination, is maybe formation of unions versus union participation overall.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting to see.
But I think there is nevertheless a real discomfort that people, I think initially it felt like, oh, this is very liberating. I can do whatever I want on my own terms, and I can do everything in this digitally connected way, and I have more agency. And then it's like, oh no, they're going to find a way not to pay you. And you have...
Their business model depends on it, right?
Yeah, their business model depends on it, and they are bigger and richer than you are and have more power than you do. And because you are not a full-time employee, you have no colleagues. There is no one to have solidarity with. Every time you think you've figured out a way to hack the system to make a little more money, they will shut it down. And so you're now in this I am going to borrow from a different triangle of doom than Sarah Longwell refers to. This is a different triangle of doom where you've got the employer and you've got the independent contractors and you've got the customers, and they're all in tension with each other because the customer feels like they're getting screwed. The independent contractor feels like they're getting screwed. And, whatever. The employer always feels like they're getting screwed by both their customers, hilariously, and their employees who are not their employees because they're on
Don't forget the shareholders. I think this actually becomes a square.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I think anymore I tend to think of the firm and the shareholders as basically being the same thing, since clearly it only exists for the shareholders. Thank you, Milton Friedman. But yeah, I think the other thing about this attempt to say, here's all this data we have about people, here's what we know about their behavior and preferences, is there is just this undercurrent of assuming that these things will remain steady. And either they will remain steady for any group of people that passes through this age cohort, or it will remain steady for that cohort as they age.
Yes.
And so people who really love taking an Uber are always going to stand with Uber.
We know that she knows that that's not so.
Yeah.
Which is funny. So she references religion, and she talks about their declining interest in religion, but the data she cites, they've become less likely to be affiliated with a particular faith. And looking at adults of all ages over time, the proportion of Americans who say they have a great deal of faith in church or organized religion has fallen from 1973 to only so and so today. It's dropped about 20 points. The point she starts with is millennials are different because they have less trust in organized faith or less interest in it. But then what she goes on to say in the same paragraph is like, actually, if you look holistically across America, all ages, interest is declining. And that's, as we maybe transition now into like how this impacts the narrative, I think this is the part where I get stuck, where it's about millennials because millennials is the first word in the sentence. But in reality, they are consistent with other generations and other Americans in that fact. Their interest in organized religion is the same. Their passion levels, the way it's distributed is roughly the same as the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
But millennials are first because that's the group we want to talk about. You could rewrite this to be about boomers. Same set of stats and just flip the order of the words, and it's still true. It doesn't yield anything that's like, and here's how Republicans can win them.
Yeah. And it does feel like straining, right? As we go through the book, it's like, oh, this looks like a promising little nugget, and maybe we can like skate to this puck right now and see if maybe they would like us for just one cycle. Like it it feels a little bit.
Some of it does, yeah.
Yes.
Some of it feels like this is a briefing doc.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think that given her firm and what it does, and given what she does for a living, like that makes a lot of sense. Like, come hire us, right? We understand, we understand how to understand voters and have a more kind of nuanced view of it, and also like spot these opportunities for connection. The great thing she couldn't have possibly seen coming was the total turn on the part of the party to not give a shit about any of that. Like,
right.
To just go, we don't have to connect on any authentic level. We can just hate things in common. It'll be great.
Yeah, exactly. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. There are also, I'll say, as someone who spent a lot of my formative years with, people who became top conservatives on Twitter, is that there are funny little obsessions in here. And like one of them, for example, is about like public sector pension funds.
Yeah, some of that gets really, really nuanced in a hurry.
Yes.
Where I'm like, my eyes are glazing over. I know.
Like public employee unions and public sector pension funds. And I'm like, none of this matters if you are not a public employee.
Totally. But that's a funny thing about the book. Like that's where the pollster expertise shines through versus the like pop demographic writer that the Selfie Vote title kind of puts you in that space. And like I said, it is a breezy read, but there are points where she dips down into like, and here's my expertise. Like, here's some real policy things that are nuanced for people in about 5 districts per state where those things matter.
Yeah. So. And then there are things in here that do remind me so much of the Republican autopsy, because it's like, there's a thing in here about, she writes, young Americans want to be in control of their own careers and their own finances. They want to be able to start small businesses. They want to be able to move up and be rewarded for what they achieve. They want to be able to change jobs along the way and not have to worry about losing their health insurance or retirement account if they do. Many of the old systems that govern careers and benefits are ripe for reform, and smart conservatives will take the lead on reaching out to young Americans with forward-looking ideas that address the changes that need to be made. And the Republican Party went, and instead,
no, we're not doing that.
Who is championing any of these things? Right. I'm sorry. Her name is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
That's a dirty word. That's a dirty word. Yes. I mean,
and that is not to say that she's a secret liberal. I'm just saying that, like, yes, conservatives could have had a story about this, but they chose not to have a story about this. But this
again,
story
it's how
also
the
is not
worm
a millennials only story. Right? Like,
correct. That's the key point.
Boomers wanted this too. Gen Xers want this. Gen Z's going to want this.
And the book could have been equally powerful if it would have said in the religion chapter, in the section that you just cited, good news, guys. Millennials are consistent with other generations, and we already have a strong, effective position on this. And here's how it goes. Like, you can still reach them. Mm-hmm. This is what's happening with religion. And look, we get this consistent story. That would have been equally effective. Like, one of my favorite things when I'm giving strategy to clients is telling them, like, hey, good news, you're already doing this. There's nothing wrong with that. But it feels like the book is like, well, here's something different about them, but it's really the same.
I agree with that. And I think this is the thing that, I come back to with a lot of the things that are, we try to attribute it to generation. And instead it's like, your brand either does this thing or it doesn't do this thing that people in this life stage and in this culture that we're living in want. When she appeared,
and you can't fix that.
Yeah. When she was on 538 recently, she did talk about, like, everybody, and Kim Parker talked about this, like everybody's attitudes about gay marriage, for example, have liberalized over the last last
Yeah.
decade. And so, that is a
I wish that
period
was in this
effect.
book. Yeah. I wish the period effects were in this book.
Exactly.
More.
Because I think one of the things that will be interesting is like, okay, young people say, and have said since the 80s, that they don't want to rely on Social Security for their retirement, and they don't think there will be any money in Social Security when they reach retirement. I mean, literally that prediction has been since like 1982 or something, maybe
Right.
sooner. But like, I remember my 30-something parents talking about how there would be no Social Security when they retired.
Mine too.
And now there is, because it is the third rail of politics for a reason. You cannot break that promise with the old, and you cannot break that promise with the disabled, and you cannot break that promise with, people who have no other means of generating income for themselves. So this is just like basics of a civilized society stuff now.
Yeah.
And so my question is like, okay, those 20 somethings or early 30 somethings in 2014 who are saying that, how do they feel when they're 45? How do they feel when they're 55? How do they feel when they're approaching 65? I bet all of a sudden they feel very differently about Social Security and pensions and retirement accounts than they do in their early 20s, because they're in a different life stage.
Right.
But there are also going to be period effects. Like, we're either going to see, economic growth, or we're going to see economic contraction. We're either going to see an expansion of the social safety net, or we're going to see it stay the same or stagnate or get smaller. Like, all of those things are also going to affect how people feel about those things. In the same way that, like, after Obergefell, after Lawrence versus Texas, people's opinions about the LGBTQ plus community liberalized across the board. Everybody got more liberal about it. Because once you legalize something, well, then it's okay. So once the system's in place, then we learn to live with the system. We're adaptive social creatures. That's kind of what we do. It's how we survive. And this just doesn't take into account that. But I understand why, right? Like, it's cycle by cycle taking advantage of whatever you can take advantage of in order to get engagement, turnout, etc. And like, that's why you're right. I think it is a briefing document for a fair-minded conservative campaign, not the Trump campaign,
and that's why it's hard to
immediately after.
That's why it's hard for her to produce a book. Because I think she is cycle to cycle, election to election, season to season, and a book is a lasting artifact. So you read it and you're like, well, maybe point in time some of this. Like I said, I don't. There's not a lot in here that I say like, oh, I disagree or this is wrong. It's just kind of nuanced. Like, why did you frame it that way?
Yeah.
And I have a question.
No, go ahead.
Do you think I want to think about? We've talked about the text of the book, but I'm thinking about now the context of the book in the narrative. In this author's mind, are millennials at this point in the narrative the hero, the villain, or something else?
I think they are probably not a necessary evil, but like a necessary constituency. Like, the feeling in the circle she's traveling in is, long term, we're not going to win if we don't get them. And we need to get some of them, and then hope that rightward shift happens over time to get more of them as they age. But right now, while they're young, how do we find common cause with them? And I actually want to give her a lot of credit. She's looking for authentic places of connection. She's not trying to manufacture a set of beliefs or, pick a fight with them or any of that kind of thing. She's looking for these places where actually we share values. And so, even in like the stuff about religion, she's looking for that of, they do have a sense of right and wrong, and they do have a sense of treating others the way you would like to be treated. And, so we can find common values somewhere in here, even if you don't go to church regularly.
Right.
So I think she's trying to say, like, love them or hate them, they have to be part of your voters if you want to win elections. And in order for them to be part of your voters, we have to adapt a little. We either have to find authentic places of connection where we don't have to change that much, but we have to talk about what we believe in the way they will appreciate and understand. Or we might want to moderate on some of these things to be more relevant to what they care about. I don't think what I think is interesting now that we talk about it is I don't feel like she is actually doing what the GOP autopsy did, which was to say, we need to get more liberal about stuff. I mean, that's more
which
or
is why
less
it
what that
couldn't.
report said.
Which is
This
why
is
that
more
report
like,
couldn't be actioned on. Like they were like, well, what do we do with this? These are not our positions. Like, okay, so we'll just,
I mean,
a lot
at
of the stuff in that.
here's what's really funny, right? When that report comes out, a lot of the people working in the Republican Party are people like Tim Miller and Sarah Longwell at the Bulwark, who are young, are millennial, gay
Right.
Republicans. The Log Cabin Republicans were a welcome group in the party up until kind of the Tea Party era. And
Mm-hmm.
like there was a sense that this had no particular maybe we don't believe in gay marriage, but we're fine with domestic partnerships. Maybe we're a little uncomfortable with gay parents adopting children, but we can find our way there. I think there was a sense, and Sarah Longwell talks about this on in the Bulwark frequently, like that this was a done deal. Like it was just inexorably going to move towards that, and most of the country was going to embrace gay marriage and gay rights. And so there was no reason that the Republican Party should be exempt from that, that we would all just wind up there and it wouldn't be a thing we argued about anymore. Immigration, there was a huge move. I mean, the Bush administration wanted to liberalize immigration. Like there was this whole side of the Republican Party that was generally speaking in favor of immigration and also kind of pro-Hispanic communities, because there was a belief that Hispanics shared cultural
Yeah,
values with
conservative
conservatives
values. Yeah.
because of their Christianity and conservatism or Catholicism. And so like their family values alignment would bring them into the tent. And as that
Mm-hmm.
segment of the population grew, that would be a net positive for Republicans in elections. But never doubt the power of racism, right? Like never sleep on that, because it will
Yeah.
come for whoever it needs to come for in order for certain kinds of people to get in power. And I think that's the thing. I think there were a lot of well-intentioned, we would now consider to be moderate Republicans that just thought that like the whole culture was moderating on these things and that it wasn't outside Republicanism to be cool with that stuff. And that it was a good electoral strategy. I mean, we're talking about people like Ari Fleischer and, all of Haley Barbour and all of these people running that report who just thought like, this is the future. This is where we have to go in order to make this work. And there are clear policy decisions we can make. One is like, just back off on the gay stuff. Like, just stop talking about the gay stuff and let that do what it's going to do. And on immigration, like figure out a path to citizenship for people and liberalize some of the immigration methods. And it just didn't see a whole lot of things coming. It I think didn't anticipate the breakdown of civil society in Latin America and South America. It didn't anticipate the rise of Trump.
And this book obviously couldn't have forecasted a lot of those things either. It's very focused on millennials at that time and place.
Yeah. And I think it also
what we knew and what we thought.
Right. It is also this wonderful indicator that like there are people who identify as Republicans, or used to anyway, who are in fact not racist and not anti-gay. This just wasn't in their particular radar, and it's a kind of sweet postcard from the past in some respects, because it's like, oh, bless your hearts. Unfortunately, you just got railroaded by this other contingency that you guys always thought you kind of had under control, and you didn't. And so now, you've got a whole other set of problems besides how to connect with millennials.
Right.
But it does go back to my thing about, there are period effects around what brands are attractive, and so. If we're all kind of dealing with a set of cultural norms that I grew up with versus people who are 15 years younger than me grew up with versus people 15 years older than me grew up with, that is going to express itself in what brands I prefer.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes the brands of the political parties. And so like, right now, my theory about this is not really that millennials are so much further to the left than their parents were on any kind of, if there was such a way as to like objectively evaluate that, which there isn't, but rather that the brand of the Republican Party is so toxic for so many people who grew up with those sets of cultural norms that they just can't select that brand.
You can't get there. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know that, we are living in the era of liquid death, not Jolt Cola, right? Like, people want to buy hardcore water in a can as opposed to something that's all the sugar and twice the caffeine, right?
I get very confused about hardcore water in a can. I don't understand it. I don't,
It's hilarious. It's like,
I don't understand any part of it.
it is so Gen X, first of all. It is so Gen X as a cultural sort of thing. It's like hardcore kid who's also straight edge. Like,
Oh yeah, that I get.
That's what it is. And
Yeah.
I will just, like, this has nothing to do with Kristen Soltis Anderson's very, admirable book, but it is hilarious to me. It was the only ad I laughed at in the Super Bowl, was like, here's a pregnant woman who goes and opens this thing that looks like beer and just guzzles it, and little kids just guzzling it. And I was like, what the hell is this? And it's water in a can, but it's hardcore.
Yeah.
Anyway, but like, that is a period effect. And like, we're more health conscious than we were then. And it's not cute to let little kids over caffeinate and have too much sugar. Like, like,
Right.
we just,
Or college students. Yeah.
Right. Or college students. Right.
Yeah.
But, so these are things that are really, it's hard, I think. And again, I go back to that conversation I had with her and Patrick many years ago now, of just coming away going, you're so, unfortunately thrust into the prediction game. And I get to live over here in the learning game. And like, everything is about seeing things change over time, observing those changes over time. How do you kind of catch the wave, as opposed to how do you predict where the wave is going to go?
I wonder what this book would be like if she didn't have to be in the prediction game. Because she's a capable writer. She's obviously got a grasp on all the data. And I wonder if she could have, I think it would be a really valuable book for the research we're doing if it didn't have to be in like, and so therefore you should do this.
Yeah.
If it was seeking those kind of conclusions. I would love to have an opportunity to talk to her about just what she knows about millennials and what she thought about them at that time in light of culture versus that prediction, that end state of like, okay, but on November 8th, what's going to happen, or whatever the Tuesday date is.
It is what I think we should also link to that 538 Politics episode she was on relatively recently, because I think some of that thinking is reflected in that conversation about,
True.
About drawing the distinction between kind of tracking millennials as they aged versus looking at age cohorts in snapshots in time, and then also trying to understand what's the starting point versus what's the likely end point. And I think it would be interesting to ask her to talk about that in light of all that's changed, for sure. But I love that provocation of like, what if you didn't have to make a prediction about what will work? And instead,
I'm hoping
just
we
think about who these
as an
folks are.
expansion of book club. I'm hoping we get a chance to talk to some of these, some of the authors, and pick their brains on it and debate a little bit. But we'll see what we're able to dig up. This concludes the premiere chapter of book club. Up next, though, when we come back to book club, the next book we are currently digging into is The Generation Myth, Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think by Bobby Duffy. So I don't know when we will record that one, but that'll be the next book in the list, and we're working our way down a list. I think if you're listening to this and you say, those guys should be reading this book, please send us a note. You can send it to Farah at inthedemopodcast.com or Adam at inthedemopodcast.com. We will add your book to our list if it meets our very rigorous standards, such as having millennial in the title. And some other stuff.
It's true. That's the only qualifier.
Pretty much. The list is getting long. So
yeah. This is good.
all right.
Now we just
Awesome.
gotta get Kristen Soltis Anderson to talk to us.
Well,
Working on it.
Yeah. Let's see what we can do.
All right.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. In the Demo is produced by Farah Bostic and Adam Pierno with support from The Difference Engine, and edited by Allison Preisinger and AMP Studio. Music by Omega Man under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research and supporting information. Please rate and review the show. Someone told us that helps.